Daily Devotion with Pastor Balla for March 5th, 2025. The Ordinary Power of Prayer from James chapter 5, verse 17. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. James offers a stunning example of prayer's power by pointing to Elijah, a towering figure in Israel's history. Yet, he begins with a surprising truth. Elijah was just a man, like us. This isn't about elevating Elijah to some unreachable pedestal. It's about bringing the extraordinary within reach of the ordinary. His story reminds us that God works through flawed, faithful people like you and me. Elijah's prayer that stopped the rain wasn't rooted in his own greatness, but in his fervent trust in God. The drought, lasting 3.5 years, was a divine judgment on Israel's idolatry. Yet it began with a man's plea. James highlights this to show that prayer isn't a passive act. It's a bold, active engagement with God's will. Elijah didn't just wish for change. He prayed intensely, aligning his heart with God's purpose. What's remarkable here is the phrase, a nature like ours. Elijah wasn't immune to fear or doubt. We see him later in Scripture fleeing from Jezebel and wrestling with despair. Yet God used his prayers mightily. This tells us that the power of prayer doesn't depend on our perfection, but on God's faithfulness. Our human frailty doesn't disqualify us. It's the very context in which God's strength shines. So this verse builds on James' earlier teaching about the prayer of a righteous person having great power. Elijah's righteousness came from his faith in God, not from a spotless life. Like us, he was justified by grace, and his prayers became a conduit for God's action. The drought wasn't the end of the story. Rain returned after Elijah prayed again, showing that God's mercy follows his judgment. This cycle of prayer reflects God's desire to restore, not just to punish. For us today, Elijah's example is both encouragement and a challenge. We might not pray for droughts, but we face our own battles, personal struggles, broken relationships, or a world in need. James invites us to see prayer as a tool God has given us to participate in his work. It's not about forcing God's hand, but about trusting him enough to ask boldly, knowing he hears. Our nature like Elijah means we bring our weaknesses, our doubts, and our hopes to God. Fervent prayer doesn't require eloquence. It requires faith, a faith that clings to God's promises, even when the skies stay dry. Through Elijah, we learn that ordinary people in God's hands can see extraordinary outcomes. So let us take heart. Our prayers, offered in faith, have power because they rest in the one who holds all things. Like Elijah, We are called to pray with trust, believing God is at work in every moment. God's peace and many blessings be with you, and thank you for listening. And please take an opportunity to share this message with others.